When the Declaration of Independence is written, what made the United States extraordinary in wanting to set up a democratic government, this was going to be a government that was established not based on one's ancestry, not based on one's status, but based on an idea.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is what it means to be an American.
All of Lincoln's political thinking, at least according to Lincoln, had to do with the principles in the Declaration of Independence. And that principle, that one thing, was that all men are created equal.
Lincoln expresses a certain sense of anxiety that Americans, as they lose their memory, a living memory of the Revolution, may also be losing their grip on the Revolution's principles.
Lincoln tried to get us to see that the most valuable thing we possess as Americans is that original charter of our freedom, and that's the Declaration of Independence. The attempt by Americans to govern themselves, in other words, a free people in a civil society, that attempt has been referred to as the American experiment. The idea of human equality, the idea of individual rights, the idea that you couldn't govern people, tell them what to do without asking their permission first, what we call consent of the governed. And if any free people thought that their government was not respecting those ends, those purposes, that nature of humanity, that everyone is a rights-bearing individual, that we had not only the right but the duty to throw off such a government, what the Declaration refers to as to alter or abolish such institutions. So the right of revolution, in short. Those were the central tenets, the components of the American experiment.
The first Lincolns we have record of made their transition across the Atlantic to Massachusetts as part of the Great Migration of the 17th century. And Lincoln's grandfather, also named Abraham, was involved in the American Revolution in the Virginia militia. And Abraham Lincoln, the president, is the namesake. Born as he was in 1809, he could easily have grown up hearing direct reminiscences of the Revolution from settlers all around him in Kentucky. And then when the Lincoln family uproots and moves across the Ohio River into southern Indiana, from revolutionary veterans who might be living there.
There was considerable pride in those family members who had sacrificed and or survived the American Revolution. Most families were only 2 generations removed, right? 7 years ago. That's not a long time. And it's not every day that a country throws off an empire and then manages to create something that has a certain level of longevity to it. So he would have certainly heard the stories. And then the other part of it is that Lincoln, he was particularly fascinated by his own country.
Lincoln was a reader from early childhood, he was. And I think the older he got, the more he read, the more experiences he had, the more he related those to what had happened with the founding. And so the whole idea that everybody should have the opportunity to sort of control their own destiny, Lincoln was all about that.
For instance, he uses as a textbook Bingham's Columbian Orator. Well, Columbian Orator makes copious references to the Revolution and its principles, and Lincoln begins to pick up what you could call a political education. He specifically, years later, will point to one book in particular, and that is Mason Weems's famous Life of Washington. Today, we tend to regard Weems's biography as more a matter of myth-making than actual researched fact. But that was the book he read even as a boy, and he said it made a tremendous impression on him. These revolutionary strugglers had something else in view beyond just independence from the mother country, from Great Britain. That there were great principles that they were fighting for, And those great principles were the things he aimed to preserve in his own generation and in his own labors as president.
From those books, he discovered not only the writings and stories of George Washington, but especially the writings of Thomas Jefferson, and most importantly, the Declaration of Independence. It's in the Declaration of Independence that he discovered and became enamored with the central ideas of the founding, especially the idea of human equality.
Magna Carta, the Declaration, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the Constitution, these are things that they would have been reading and would have been not only foundational to Lincoln's legal mind and practice, but some of these were more foundational just to his understanding of what it meant to be an American.
What worried Lincoln was, what about people who had come to America who could not trace their ancestry to the Revolution by blood? And what about their attachment to the country, anybody's attachment to the country, the further away we got as a people? Lincoln, in the 1830s, as a state representative in the Illinois State House, gives a speech, and his concern is precisely that people are no longer as emotionally attached to the achievements of the founding. And Lincoln said, that's actually a threat to the continuance, to what he called the perpetuation of our political institutions. We don't have the advantage that the founders had, this external foe. We have to come up with rational means of holding on to the things that are essential to preserving our rights.
Lincoln had a personal connection, a family connection to the Revolution. But more importantly than that, I think, was his belief that the Revolution and the Declaration set America onto a path that made it unique from all countries in the world. And I think that is the reason why that he would leave home, that he would strike out on his own, and then settle eventually into politics, because he understood that there was a place that he could make a difference and that he could help the nation further its quest for equality and liberty for all people.
Lincoln does not actually have terribly much to say about the Declaration of Independence before 1854. And it changes because of the disaster of the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which made it possible to contemplate the idea of slavery being exported to the Western territories and thus becoming future slave states. Lincoln had always believed up till that point that slavery was one of those unhappy inheritances from British Empire days that were on their way out. Kansas-Nebraska changed that completely. The difficulty this posed for Lincoln was that, first of all, this was an act of Congress, arrived at democratically. And the decision process was a process known as popular sovereignty. If a majority of people in the territories wanted to legalize slavery, on what grounds could you tell them they couldn't do that? And at that point, Lincoln said, I think I have a ground for telling Americans why they cannot and must not do that. And that is what is found in the Declaration of Independence.
At the eve of the American Revolution, the enslavement of African people, and to some degree, some Native people, is law in all 13 colonies. But Jefferson and his Committee of Five from the Continental Congress create this document, this declaration, that includes in it statements about the rights of man. So much so, the colonies that could, many immediately abolish the institution of slavery as being inconsistent with the ideals of the new nation. So this is the first really big abolitionist movement in America, is the Declaration of Independence.
The Republican Party was fervently in favor of interpreting the Declaration of Independence equality statement as a universal statement about human beings as human beings, equal in their rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So fervently anti-slavery. The Democratic Party split. Northern Democrats, led by the most important politician of the 1850s, Stephen Arnold Douglas, Lincoln's longtime nemesis, Illinois senator. Stephen Douglas believed that the founders were neutral, were amoral on the subject of slavery. In other words, the founders didn't take a position on slavery. They let slave states be slave states and free states be free states. They didn't give power to Congress to ban slavery where it already existed, and therefore we should follow their example. Southern Democrats disagreed. There is a right to property in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. And therefore, if you take your property, including property in human beings, chattel slaves, if you take them to a federal territory, they have a constitutional right to have that property protected.
Generally, Americans would have felt that the Declaration of Independence, at least, and the Constitution were not meant for people who were seen as inferior. So it would not have included Black people, whether they were enslaved or free. It would not have included Native people, the indigenous population. It would have included women only to the extent that they were represented by their husbands or their sons or their fathers. But Lincoln saw it differently. He felt that the founders believed that by establishing this new nation on that principle that all men were created equal, they would find a way to get as close as possible to the reality of equality for all people. And so even if you can't do it in 1776, the idea was to constantly move in that direction.
So he will say in response to Douglas, "In the right of the black man to eat the bread he has earned by the sweat of his brow, he is my equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every living man." Now we might say, well, yes, he was only talking about natural rights, not civil rights. Stephen Douglas saw that the gap between the two was not nearly so great. For Douglas says, if you want to see voting rights and jury rights and office rights conveyed to black people, vote for Lincoln, because that's where Lincoln's ideas are going to take you. I mean, he talks about natural rights, but as soon as you grant that, it's going to be civil rights before you know it. That's waiting right around the corner. And it may be that Stephen A. Douglas was finally right for one time in his life. He saw exactly where Lincoln's position was going to go.
Lincoln absolutely believed all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. He believed that to his core. All men, as in all mankind. And Lincoln recognizes that we have to finish this. We have allowed this to continue, which ultimately have harmed the growth of the Republic.
In 1860, it was quite clear that election was essentially settled over the question of who had the proper understanding, the proper interpretation of the founding, and in particular, how to interpret the Constitution in light of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. What government doesn't give us is our rights. It gives us the protection or the security to exercise our rights freely. That understanding, which Lincoln believed was the original understanding, was Jefferson's understanding, Washington's, Madison's, generally speaking, the founding generation. That understanding had been contested from the beginning because there were those who had a financial interest and a social interest in maintaining their place in the civil pecking order, as it were. We need to bring it back to what Lincoln, believes is the true understanding of the founding, our revolutionary fathers, and that understanding is human equality. All men are created equal. That includes the black man.
Lincoln had always felt that the Declaration of Independence was the foundation for government and society. The government was supposed to be an entity that was to protect the rights of the people and that would give them an opportunity to excel. His political thinking, his political actions are always governed by that thought. And we see that in the 1830s when he first gets into the state legislature. We see it when he becomes a congressman for that one term. We certainly do see it after the Kansas-Nebraska Act and that whole crisis decade of the 1850s, and we see it right into the war.
People sometimes like to talk about Lincoln evolving, that here was a man who only believed in restraining the extent of slavery up until the 1850s. Then he wants to prevent slavery from being legalized in the territories, but he's not promoting abolition. And then he is the man who, in his first inaugural address, insists that he has no intention of meddling with the domestic institutions of the slave states, but who will, within 2 years, issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And people will ask, isn't this not ipso facto a proof of Lincoln's evolving? Well, did he not also evolve in his understanding of the Declaration of Independence? My sense of Lincoln is that the man you meet in 1838 is still the man that you meet in 1863. What changes are the circumstances in which he has to operate. And that will, of course, call forth from him different policies.
It helped that the principles of the Declaration were universal. It didn't matter what your nationality was. It didn't matter what language you spoke. It didn't matter what religion you practiced. It didn't matter what sex you were, your ethnicity, your race. These were irrelevant in terms of what it meant to be a citizen. It wasn't a blood thing. It was an idea thing.
In September of 1863, his ever-ambitious Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, wrote to him urging him to expand the scope of the Emancipation Proclamation unilaterally. The proclamation, technically speaking, in law, only applied to those states which were in rebellion against the United States. No emancipation took place as a result of that proclamation in the 4 border states that remained in the Union, but which nevertheless still legalized slavery. Chase wanted the Emancipation Proclamation expanded to cover them, and he urged Lincoln to do it on his own personal authority as president. Lincoln's response was interesting. He replied to Chase and said, "I don't have that kind of authority. I'm only the president of the United States."
What Lincoln thought was at stake in the Civil War was not so much the immediate future of slavery. What was at stake is our very constitutional way of life. We had a legitimate election where the Republicans won, Lincoln in particular, fair and square, and republics to remain viable, generation after generation, you have to produce good winners and good losers. You can't just say, I'll abide by the result if my guy wins. And until the incoming administration does something unconstitutional, we have to keep our hands to ourselves. We don't have the right, whether peacefully through ordinances of secession or through violence, bullets and bayonets, we don't have the right to resist the enforcement of the Constitution and the laws. That's what Lincoln had to deal with when he came into power March 4th, 1861. He doesn't turn to emancipation until he can turn a humanitarian end, the liberation of 3 to 4 million Black people, into a constitutional means.
Now, he will make decisions during his presidency that would push the edge of that, but still within his power. He was very, very clear about where his powers actually lie. He is trying to remind the American people of how we began and why we began and what we said we believed. And of course, his shortest and most famous speech, he starts right out of the gate with it.
77 years ago, the Revolutionary Fathers had established this new nation, a new nation dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal.
And it is a reference to the founding generation. It is a reference to a government for the people, by the people. He pulls out all stops to remind people of why this union and why the blood shed to protect it is so important.
Politics isn't just about doing the right thing, it's about doing the right thing in the right way. And under the Declaration of Independence's principles, doing things in the right way meant doing them by the permission of the people. And the most fundamental expression of that consent is the Constitution.
Lincoln certainly was someone who believed that America should be inclusive, that it should embrace all people. He believed that the founding principles were a beacon or drew people to the shores of America. And he was more than willing to welcome them with open arms.
What explains America to them? This, he said, when they read in that Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, then they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and bone of the bone of those old men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are. That, Lincoln said, is the electric cord that runs through lovers of liberty around the world.
And Lincoln understood that. He understood that America was a place where someone who had been oppressed in another country could come and find liberty.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That is the principle he lived by, the principle of the Declaration. And in a real sense, it's the principle he died by.
Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence is far more profound and intentional than the way we think about it today. And so we begin to wonder why people have differing or contested views of what America is and what her values are. And unfortunately, it's very easy to be cynical when you haven't felt that you've been included or systemically denied. The remarkable thing is, from when Frederick Douglass first said, "To what is the American slave is your 4th of July?" to Martin Luther King talking about that the Declaration of Independence is a promissory note. In neither case were they saying throw it away. What each of them were saying is live up to it. And I think that's what Lincoln was saying too. Live up to it.
I think Lincoln gave us a perfect roadmap to how we sustain the democracy, how we live up to that principle of equality and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On his way to Washington, after he was elected, he told the people he was not the answer to saving democracy. Politicians are not the answer. The answer is with the people. We have to be committed to what those principles meant. It's what makes us who we are or what we hope to be as a nation.
Citizen is the highest title, the only title that this country bestows. President, member of Congress, those are only temporary. There's only one permanent title for an American, and that is citizen. Lincoln understood that he was a citizen like all the other citizens of the United States. He made generous allowance for his fellow Americans, even when he disagreed with them. And of course, at the very end, in that second inaugural, his words are carved into the wall of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, with malice toward none, with charity for all. It was a lesson that needed badly to be learned in his time. It is a lesson I think that we need to embrace today. The lesson that we are, at the end of the day, all citizens together in this American experiment.
Even the fiercest critics of America acknowledge that the reasons they believe our country to have fallen short are reasons they find rooted in the principles of the Declaration. But I do believe we are not familiar enough with it. If Lincoln were alive today, Lincoln would be laser focused, I think, on civic education. Lincoln thought the Declaration has the answers we need to solve our political problems back in his day. Our problems today can also be solved by reacquainting ourselves with the key principles of the Declaration of Independence as enshrined by the Constitution.
I hope that we acknowledge again the importance of civic education in the lives of the American populace. And this is one of the things that the founders were very intentional about, especially Jefferson, who very much believed in free public education and libraries for the dispensement and to ensure that the population was informed. And if they are knowledgeable and informed, they can sustain self-governance. Without it, we fall to despots.
I want us to embrace the founding principles as though they happened yesterday, not simply because of the telescoped nature of American existence, but also because those ideas, they still mean the same things that were meant in July of 1776. My whole identity is built around the premise that every citizen stands free and equal with every other to make of themselves what they possibly can in the opportunity of this nation. And the day that that premise ceases to be the nuclear core of what it is to be an American is the day when we cease to be able to speak of Americans. That single proposition, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By that proposition, we rise. Without it, we fall.